coverage. Talk show host Tavis Smiley moderates a forum on the challenges facing our country, including energy independence, the economy, education, and healthcare reform. You're watching C-SPAN.
Tavis Smiley and Nationwide on your side.
Good evening and welcome to the Listener Auditorium here on the campus of George Washington University. I'm Tavis Smiley, and tonight we've assembled an outstanding group of thought leaders and journalists for a wide-ranging conversation about the current and future state of this country. The theme tonight is America's Next Chapter, a 3-hour conversation about where this country is early in the first decade of the 21st century. My thanks to the good people of Nationwide Insurance for helping to make this evening possible, and to C-SPAN. Please let's thank C-SPAN for covering this conversation this evening. Let's meet our terrific panel. He is the chief political correspondent for CBN News, the Christian Broadcasting Network. Please welcome tonight, David Brody.
Thank you, Chad.
Thanks, David. She's the co-founder and executive director of Voto Latino, Maria Teresa Kumar. Please welcome her. Political columnist for the Washington Post and must-read copy in this town and beyond. Please welcome Dana Milbank. She is the creator and editor-in-chief of one of the best sites on the web, the Huffington Post. Please welcome Ariana Huffington. The widely respected anchor of CNBC's Closing Bell and the host of the Wall Street Journal Report with Maria Bartiromo. Maria Bartiromo. He is the best-selling author and Princeton professor, and I'm honored to have him as my co-host on the PRI radio program, Smiley and West. Please welcome Dr. Cornel West. He's also a best-selling author and former speechwriter for George W. Bush, who now heads the Frum Forum. Please welcome David Frum. And finally, the CEO of the software giant Sybase and chairman of the Committee of 100, our friend John Chen. Please welcome him. I think I want to start our conversation first with Dr. West, and I only do that because I was reading some clips of some of his media appearances of late. One in particular, Doc, where you were being asked about this conversation, and I thought we were friends until I read this article. We have called this conversation America's Next Chapter, and in the subhead we have talked about how America can return to its greatness. I want to start with words and the theme before we get into the particulars. We've got 3 hours to drill down on this. But you took exception in the piece that I read on a particular media outlet with the notion of America returning to its greatness. I'm going to let you unpack what you had to say about that, but talk to me first of all, philosophically, politically, socially, culturally, how you see this notion of America's greatness and whether it ever existed and whether or not we can ever return to it if it ever existed.
Mm-hmm. First, I want to thank you for bringing us together. We need to have this conversation at this moment in the history of this very fragile experiment in democracy called the United States of America, USA. Now, what I meant is that for me, the very notion of a great nation is a bit oxymoronic because I come out of a Christian tradition that says the greatest among you will be the servant to the poor. And I don't know of a nation that's treating its poor with the level of dignity that it ought. So that when I think of Alexander the Great, Alexander's not great to me. He just dominated and conquered a lot of people. Napoleon's not great. He just dominated and conquered a lot of people. That for me, the legacy of Martin King, the legacy of Dorothy Irene Height, this is the founding day of the Delta 98-year celebration. It focuses on the least of these. How are you doing with the prisoners? How are you doing with the orphans? How are you doing with the widows? How are you doing with the fatherless, the motherless, the working classes, and so forth? So military might, America, unbelievable. Upward social mobility, America, unbelievable. Technological innovation, America, unbelievable. Rights and liberties at its best, America, unbelievable. But greatness has to do with how are your poor and working people doing. That's the vantage point for me. And so the legacy of Martin King and Dorothy Height, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who said, The future of America rests on how we respond to the legacy of Martin King. When I look at how our poor people are doing, not very well. Downward mobility, the new poor, chronic poor, locked into a prison-industrial complex, militarism, not just Afghanistan, but the military-industrial complex with the Pentagon and the military budget being 50% of the U.S. budget, which means there's no wiggle room to even deal with the situation of working people and poor people oftentimes in our debate about the budget. And then there's the spiritual issue, the materialism, the hedonism, the narcissism, the kind of spiritual malnutrition and moral constipation that we see in the nation. The emptiness of soul and the right and good being stuck and you can't get it out. That's morally constipated. The right and the good won't flow. And I'm not just talking about our Wall Street brothers and sisters. They're human beings like anybody else, but too much greed. Our military-industrial complex with the private contracts, the U.S. government, too much monopoly. Our debate about education, the privatizing taking place, and too many of our teachers and teachers' unions being cast as almost the welfare queens 15, 20 years ago. You see? We know teachers need to do the job, no doubt about that. But $4 billion every month in Afghanistan, and we got a $4 billion program for Race to the Top. That's warped priorities, deeply warped priority. So for me, coming out of the legacy of Martin and Curtis Mayfield and some other great freedom fighters, I think we're in very deep trouble. So it's not returning to America's greatness, it's trying to make America greater with great courage, great love, great commitment to public interest and common good. But for me, in the end, no nation is going to be great because every nation I know is going to be shot through with greed and domination and oppression. And the best that we can do is try to gain some accountability vis-a-vis poor and working people as our elites, our oligarchs, and others continue to dominate our government and economy.
If Dr. West is right, yes, sure. If Dr. West is right, Ariana, about the fact that it's about our nation trying to become greater, I'm trying to juxtapose that notion with your recent best-selling book, Third World America, where you argue, and I'll let you unpack this, that if we don't change a whole lot about the way we do business in this country, we may end up a third world America one day. Get me from West talking about we need to become greater to your notion that we are slipping toward becoming a third world America. Can you juxtapose those two things for me?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I would like to spend the next 3 hours listening to Dr. West. I was just like completely spellbound. And then at some point I thought, oh, at some point Tavis is going to come to me, and I would so much rather just sit here listening. And one of the reasons is that I think we're all so starved of poetry in our public discourse. Everything is so prosaic, so much about data. And so just listening to Cornell kind of reminds us of how malnourished we are when it comes to that. I don't think there's any contradiction between what Cornell is saying and what I wrote in Third World America. First of all, let me just say that I don't think we can ever return to anything, even if there was such a thing as American absolute greatness, including towards our poor and our working people. My Greek compatriot, the philosopher Heraclitus said, you can never enter into the same river twice. Everything flows, everything moves on, everything changes. So having made that philosophical point, practically, as an immigrant to this country, this accent is for real. I'm acutely aware of how we are losing the American dream, because I lived it. And as we are looking now at the possibility of upward mobility, the possibility of working hard, playing by the rules, and doing well, and your children doing even better, becoming really impossible for millions of Americans, we see that since the middle class is at the heart of any first world country, if we lose our middle class, as we're in danger of doing right now, we do become third world America. And the statistics, I hate to cite statistics after Dr. West, but we have 100 million people right now who are worse off than their parents were. And when it comes to upward mobility, we are 10th. We are after France, after Spain, after the Scandinavian countries. To be behind France in upward mobility would be as if France were behind us in croissants and afternoon sex. So that's my concern, and we have a lot of time to discuss the fact that ultimately I'm optimistic. I know you want us to start with the darkness, and it's good to dwell in the darkness for a little while, but ultimately I believe in this incredible American character, this incredible American compassion that we see expressed all around the country in our small communities, but we just need to scale it, accelerate it, and make it part of our everyday lives.
I'm going to get everybody involved before I start, mixing it up, but I want to pick up on something you said and just do a quick follow-up. I'm still in my mind trying to juxtapose Doc suggesting that what we're missing is a focus on the weak working class. We're missing, Ariana, a focus on the poor. And I hear you suggesting that we have to save the middle class. How do we save and focus on the middle class if that is your suggestion when Doc is saying what we're missing is a focus on the poor?
I don't think there's any contradiction at all. The middle class are the new poor.
Okay.
They have been added. They have been added to the chronic poor. If you look at what's happening in our homeless shelters now, if you look at what's happening at the food banks around the country, there are more and more middle-class people who've lost their jobs, have lost their homes. About 2 million people, 2 million families have lost their homes in the last 2 years through foreclosures. I mean, just stop and imagine that. Last night the president eulogized in incredibly eloquent and moving terms Christina, the 9-year-old who died. And our hearts were broken by that death. But what about all the 9-year-olds around this country who have no hope for their future, who have talents, who have gifts, but cannot actualize them? I mean, the greatest way to honor Christina would be to begin to focus on the 9-year-olds around the country and all the other kids who are homeless, who can't get a decent education, and who can't live the American dream, and they're still alive, so we can do something about them.
There was, not so long ago, just days ago, in fact, Dana Milbank of the Washington Post, a report released called the Rasmussen Report. And this report, Dana, finds that almost half of the American people think that our best days as a nation are behind us. I mean, feel that, wrestle with that for a second. That almost half of us apparently think that the best days of this nation are behind us. Now, whether you believe numbers like that or not, it's pretty clear to me as I travel around the country, I know you all do, that this feeling of angst and helplessness and hopelessness, and to Ariana's point, concern about the future and whether or not their kids and grandkids are going to do as well as they have done. How do you move a country forward? How do you put a country on the right track if half of its citizenry think that its best days, Dana, are behind it?
Well, Tavis, it's a grim statistic. I mean, to the extent there's any good news here, it's that a lot of the reason we're all feeling so bad is because of a short-term problem in the economy. We have two problems going on here. One is that we've just fallen off this economic cliff, which have made all the statistics worse, and which have just made the American public extraordinarily dour. I mean, more than 75–80% of the people feel that we're on the wrong track right now. And I think that's what gets at this statistic you're bringing out here, because that is overlaid with a sense that our problems are greater than the economic cycle. And, we probably have reached a point where the improving living standards are going to slow down, just for demographic reasons. We have reached a point where the rest of the world has caught up. America will no longer dominate the way it once did economically, militarily. That does not mean that we necessarily are going to suffer lower living standards, but you've got these two things coming together here now, and our problems are large but not insurmountable. What's happening right now is that they seem insurmountable because 15 million people are out of work, because so many people believe we just can't come to grips with the short-term problems.
John Chen, Dana suggested that, not suggested, said in fact, that we have to recognize the fact that we, the United States of America, can no longer dominate. Let me just ask you a direct and point-blank question. If the 20th century belonged to the United States, does the 21st century belong to China? Do we just need to accept the fact that we won it in the 20th century, but it belongs to China in the 21st century? I ask that because we all know that Hu Jintao, the leader of China, headed to this city in a matter of days to spend a few days with President Obama in a summit. So, the question, does the 21st century belong to China?
Well, first I have two other comments before I answer your question. First, I'm so glad I didn't go to Princeton, because I didn't understand half of what Dr. West said, so I would have flunked the class. I would never graduate. I wouldn't be sitting here. That's number one. And I think I would first say to you, I mean, I run around the world, and I'm fortunate enough to do a lot of business around the world. We beat ourselves up pretty bad. I think that's one thing that we always like to do. And I think, there's a lot of countries out there love to be America. They love Americans. So, and the fact of the matter that we're all sitting here talking about this very openly with very diverse background, it's a good sign. There are a lot of culture, political faction powers out there that these kind of discussion would have never happened, nor would it happen, or anything will happen as a result of that. So that's the first thing. We got to not beat ourselves up first. Okay, I'm going to answer your question about China. Sure. And by the way, not to say that we don't have problems. That's not the issue. Well, it's the rate of growth. This is like companies. Mature companies grow slower. Mature markets size bigger. China is, caught on to, we've been telling them how to do things. Do it this way, do it this way. Eventually said, okay, we'll do it this way. But when they did it, it certainly worked, and the rate of growth is a lot faster. And their attitudes are very different. They're a lot more hungrier than us. But they also have issues that if they don't continue to grow peacefully, and I'm sure that in the 3 hours we're going to talk about securities somehow. If they don't continue to grow peacefully, the political and social stability will be called into questions. So as such, right now, if you ask the Chinese people, the majority of those people, with the 300 million middle class that came, I think it's a total 1.3 billion, they still have a lot of challenge, but the 300 million middle class and the other one who aspire to be that middle class, they rather have the current growth structure than some of the stuff that we like to impose on them, all these like that. But given that, they have big internal demand. Everybody wants to put money there, including us, to grow that market, and they are hungry. So, the next decade, we're going to see a lot of development over there.
I want to come to the other side, to you, David Brody, because you work for a network that I think most Americans tend to view as conservative in its approach to the news and in its beliefs and values. Politically, that is. And when I listen to what John Chen had to say, I'm reminded that during this campaign, I should say back in November, during the midterm election, there was a lot of anti-China rhetoric in this campaign that we heard from a lot of folk on the right. It's easy to beat up on China because China can't respond during a midterm election race in your specific district. And I'm not suggesting that there aren't issues in China that need to be discussed and addressed. We can get to that perhaps later in this conversation. But there was a lot of anti-China rhetoric in this last election. That's just one issue on which there is a divide in this town. We know, I was just saying to somebody earlier today on this issue of civility, there's a lot of civility in Washington this week because Congress ain't in session. Next week, when they come back to work, we're going to see how that civility thing actually works out next week. But we know that we're about to enter this age, we've already entered this age now, of a divided government in this town. So whether the issue is China or a litany of other things I could roll out that I don't need to because we're all fully aware of that, what say you about what is or is not going to happen courtesy of this new divided government here in Washington?
Well, you know, if we've got 9 hours or longer, we can talk about it. I mean, you know, it's tough. It's a complicated issue. You know, I would say this. I think it starts with a moral factor in this country as it relates to God. Because if you think about it, as I travel around the country and I talk to people like Jim Wallace on the left and Ralph Reed on the right, here's one thing they agree with. There is a moral crisis in this country as it relates to everything from Wall Street to the housing market to what has happened all across this nation, especially economically. And so I would suggest that there's a lot of common ground that can be found in this area of economic catastrophe. If you will. So I think that's a very important part of it. You know, I would also suggest, as it relates to civility in government, I think what we need to see here, and this is pie in the sky potentially, but as it relates to the Tucson shooting and as it relates to the divided government we're seeing, we need the elected leaders in this country, and we need the influential commentators in this country, aka a Bill O'Reilly or a Keith Olbermann on the left and right, respectively. You know, I would suggest that some of these guys need to speak up, come together, whether it means recording a PSA announcement. Look, words have consequences.
Wait. Did you say you think that O'Reilly and Olbermann are going to do a PSA together? Is that your suggestion?
I don't think I was holding my breath when I was saying that.
Yeah.
But the point is that if you're going to get through the clutter, if you're going to really make a difference, there needs to be some shock value. And if you're going to have shock value, you need to get people that would normally be in their own entrenched warfare zones to come out and start the dialogue.
Is that our problem, David Frum? Is all of this really about a moral crisis?
I wouldn't say so. I think the people in the audience, the people at home, they know well what the problems are, and we can heap more coals on their head and remind them more. I think the thing I think about all the time is that inside each of these problems, embedded in each of the problems, is the answer. We had a demonstration of this just this week with this terrible atrocity in Tucson, and that is the horror of America: a weak mental health system, too easy access to deadly weapons, and a breakdown in community structures where somebody can. We know that. Okay, let's stop with that. Let's look at this: that this maniac did this terrible crime, and the whole political system of the country snapped together, and every loudmouth who had been pumping anger and rage into the country's bloodstream suddenly recoiled and looked around. Will people blame me? Because the political stability of the United States is like a 104-inch living room sofa. You cannot budge it. And anybody who is associated with violence or revolutionary activity is at that second discredited. Let's go through the rest of them. I mean, we've had this intense debate in 2010 over the American healthcare system and its extraordinary wastefulness, and we spend more than anybody else and we don't get good results. But what that means, within that waste, if the United States spent as much as Switzerland, the next runner-up country, there's 4 points of GDP of wasted money lying on the table. And if we can get a Sam Walton or a Henry Ford type personality to go through those systems and squeeze the waste out, there's 4 points of national wealth right there. We have terrible unemployment. But that means we have able and skilled people ready to do the jobs that the country needs doing. We have international global challenges, security challenge. We have a hungry rival nipping at the country's heels. But that also forces the country to be more competitive, to remember that it competes in a world of states that are adverse, that the country has to be disciplined and focused its resources. And it is also a reminder that more countries look to the United States force as a provider of security, and most countries of the world look to other potential rivals as providers of insecurity. We have possibilities, and what our task here, and I hope we can talk about this tonight, is how do we deploy the institutions and the personalities and the resources of the country in a way that makes those solutions effective.
You said a lot, and I want to come back to you, trust me, very quickly, and do some follow-ups. Let me bring Maria in this conversation, because as my grandmother, God rest her soul, used to say, Maria, what David just described sounds too much like right. It just sounds too much like right. Anything that he could lay out that simple or that simply, if the answer, as David Frum suggests, is to these challenges can be found in the problems themselves, how stuck on stupid are we that we can't figure out that the answer to the problem is inside the problem? So I'm not sure, with all due respect to my friend David Frum, that it's necessarily that simple, but we're obviously missing something here. From your perspective, at least economically, what are we missing here?
Well, I agree with much that has been said. What I have to push back on is my friend Dr. West here, because I think America is the greatest country in the world. And I think we were great, and we are falling a bit now, for sure, but we will get back to greatness again. Let's not underestimate the power of freedom. We talk about the challenges and the rise of the East and the decline or the bumping along the bottom of the West, but this is a free country, and the aspirational power is also amazing. The fact that you can come from nothing and work hard and get a little luck and achieve success. That's not to say we are not, that's not to say that we are taking care of all of our people properly. We are not, obviously. And we need to better care for all income levels, all areas of the country, and we have work to do there. I think the problem is clearly the jobs picture. The unemployment story is persisting. I suspect that it will continue to persist. We have real challenges overseas. China, 1.3 billion people. India, 1.1 billion people. 300 million people in this country. The numbers don't add up. Of course, at some point, China will be the largest economy in the world. America has to sell to those people, 1 billion people joining the ranks of the middle class outside of America. American companies have to sell to those companies, to those people. And I think that is also part of the story.
I think it's clear that camera 3 ought to stay trained right here the rest of the night. I think there's going to be some energy between.
At some point, I want to respond to
I'm going to come back to you, I'm sure. That's why I said, that's why I said camera 3, just get ready to stay trained right. But I want to get Maria Teresa Kumar involved in this before I get back to Bartiromo and West, or West and Bartiromo. Let me come to Maria Teresa Kumar, because I ran into Maria yesterday here in town in advance of our conversation today.
Where?
None of your business.
Now you're making it sound exciting. She's over at NPR.
She's very happily married.
I thought we might make some news.
No. She's very happily married. It was at NPR, if you must know. So we saw each other at NPR yesterday, and I heard Maria make a point yesterday that I agree with. It's hard to not agree with it. When you look at the numbers, the negative numbers, Ariana, are hitting her community, the Hispanic community, pretty hard. You know, I'm obviously part of the African American community, and the picture here ain't pretty, to be sure. But the numbers are really hitting the Hispanic community pretty hard, and Maria was laying this out. But then she closed by saying, and yet, with all that, the Hispanic community may be the most hopeful community in this country about their future. I added to that I got mad love for the Hispanic community right now, because no community in this country last year flexed politically more than the Hispanic community. They flexed last year. And I think that if you don't like the way things are going, you got to flex. You got to raise up. You got to, as we both know, politics is not what? A spectator sport. You got to get off the sideline, get involved in the process. And so the Hispanic community did that last year, and yet there weren't a lot of victories for all of that. Immigration went nowhere last year. The DREAM Act didn't go through last year. And so before we start mixing this up, I don't want to leave your community out of this. What happens in 2011 for all the energy and all the activism that you generated last year, as this campaign for the White House is about to kick up literally a matter of weeks from now?
I think it started in December.
Yeah, you're probably right about that.
But you know, actually, I want to address a little bit what we've been talking about of where we see our country going. And I actually have to side with Maria. I don't think that we are, America was great. I think that what we're seeing is a realignment that we saw during the Great Depression, and we're seeing it now through the Great Recession, where we have a completely new industry, a new type of immigrant, American in this country, and also competing on a global scale once again. And so what happened, and the lessons that we learned during the Great Depression, was that America learned to take care of our own, our poor, women, and children. And now what we are, with the Great Recession, we've had a lot of legislation that's asked us to step up to the plate through health care, through financial reform, and ask the question, are you going to take care of your poor and your children? And I have to tell you that we've done okay. And part of it is because we do see increasing change in our country, that a lot of folks in the middle class have forgotten how to be poor, and the rich have forgotten how to be middle class. And that's the conversation we need to have as well. So as we move forward as a country, one of the reasons that the American Latino community is so optimistic, despite the fact that we have the highest foreclosure rates, the highest joblessness, unfortunately the highest dropout rate, is because one of the reasons is that, and this is where I'll bring it personally, I remember my mother getting up every single morning, going to clean houses, and working 15, 16-hour jobs, and still telling me that America was the greatest country in the world. So when you have that in your household, when you have immigrant parents telling their kids, I don't care if you're from, if you're from Asia or you're from Latin America, America is where we are going to make our dream. That is our identity as an immigrant country. And I think that is our challenge, is how do we incorporate this? And then to draw in a little bit to what you were saying about China and India and a 1 billion population each, we forget the US, we have the third largest Latin American population in the world. Third largest of Latin America. So when you start talking about 1 billion people, we have it. But how do we educate our American countrymen, our brothers and sisters, so that we celebrate our diversity? Our opportunity is at our doorstep, but fundamentally, what Ariana said earlier, fundamentally what this country needs is that we need not only to, yes, talk about resources for joblessness, but we need to make sure that that 9-year-old, whether it's Ariana, Julieta, or Rajiv, is getting the best possible education, and that's our challenge as a country. Do we care?
My first responsibility was to make sure that everybody got a chance to say something initially to get this conversation going. Now we can have some fun, loosen this thing up, and start to mix it up a little bit. So I'm going right back over here first. I want to let Dr. West, respond, but I guess the backdrop of your response really, again, is what Maria Teresa Kumar just said. And what I hear when I listen to you and Maria is not a difference of agreement, not a difference rather on the notion of whether or not America is for so many people around the world a beacon of light and hope, but this notion of American exceptionalism. Yeah. That's what I hear the two of you having a disagreement about. So talk to me, Doc, first about American exceptionalism.
Yeah, I think first we have to draw a distinction between making the claim that America is great versus America's a place you want to live, vis-a-vis other nations. Other nations don't look that good either for a lot of reasons. You know what I mean? But I choose to live in America primarily because my mama's here. And my grandmama and granddad and so forth. We help make the nation whatever it is to help make it free and democratic. That's why I'm here. But the question I want to raise to my dear sister is, and this is for all of us, how many poor people, unemployed people, how many poor children, how many uneducated persons would there have to be before you call into question the greatness of the nation? What is the line in the sand? That line has already been drawn for me. When I look at these killing fields in these hoods, when I look at the war zone, the precious sister Christina Taylor Greene, God bless her soul, and the powerful speech of our dear brother Barack Obama. He's a magnificent father, we know that. He talked about the American family, his own two precious children. He was seen in Christina, but you're absolutely right. You got Letitia out there who was just shot. You got 13 people in Princess George County that just shot. We got folks dying all the time, of all colors and all classes, disproportionately poor. Disproportionately poor. So I'm not sure we're fundamentally disagreeing. It's just that my stress is on the underside. Now, no, Brother John Chin, I hope I'm speaking clearly. You understand all that?
I got it.
You understood that?
I got it.
No, he's not just a giant in business. He's a distinguished graduate of Brown University and Hong Kong University. I want to be lucid. Absolutely. But what I'm saying, but this is not beating America down. You see, when Martin Luther King gave his critique of injustice, he was not anti-American, he was anti-injustice in America. That's what we're talking about. We all want to make it better. Now, for my Canadian-born brother here, he said he could see the answers in the problems. I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure about that.
Carter.
The reason is because that I didn't hear in your analysis any talk about corporate power or Wall Street power. I didn't hear any talk in your analysis about the mustering the political will from below and the ways in which it is suffocated, sometimes crushed by the powers that be. When we hear a cry for hurt and help among poor people, we don't get a response. When we hear it from investment bankers, we get corporate welfare. That's a big difference.
I think it's
That's a
about
big
education.
difference. Yes.
I think it's about education. I think what Maria Teresa said is right on, because when you look at the differences of education in this country versus the rest of the world, we are failing. I mean, I don't think any of us would disagree.
That's
right. I mean, China. In the U.S., our kids, let's just talk simple things. Our kids go to school 5 days a week, about 7 hours a day. In China, they're going to school 6 days a week, 10 hours a day. I mean, of course, this is going to be an increasingly competitive situation. We need to give people the opportunity to get educated, work hard, and move up the ladder.
David, I want to come back to you. David Frum, that is. Dr. West has his difference with you on your formulation. I'll let you respond to that. But the thing you said that got my attention, your first example of the answers being found in the problems was this issue of the shooting in Tucson. And this whole conversation now that the country's engaged in about civility. Help me understand how it is that is the way forward if it requires a heinous act like that to get us to even have a conversation about civility. I've heard members of Congress for the last week, patting themselves on the back and sticking out their chest. This tragedy has reminded us that there are no Republicans, there are no Democrats, we're all Americans. Everybody's saying that same line that we were all Americans 2 weeks ago before it happened. And we all gonna be Americans 2 weeks from now, but we ain't talking about it no more. But my point is, it can't take a heinous act like this or 9/11 for us to all of a sudden realize magically that we're in this together and that we're all Americans.
Let me be very clear about what I mean by that, because I don't mean to look at this black hole of suffering and say here is some sunlight that comes out of it. I don't believe that that's true. I don't think that that's psychically true. I don't think that's true to look at it from the outside. What I mean to say is this. The reaction to this terrible crime has been a rediscovery, not a reaffirmation, but a rediscovery of some things that were true all along about the United States. And we have been through a 2-year economic crisis on top of 11 years of a series of failures of our political system, from the dot-com bubble that left people feeling swindled and suckered, to wars that have been frustrating, the stagnation of incomes through the middle part of the last decade, culminating with this crisis, the inability of the government to police the borders effectively, the inability of the government to act on the information that could have been assembled to prevent 9/11, failure after failure after failure of governmental policy. And people are right to be very fed up with that. But what we've also discovered is that these free institutions of the American society, they really work. And in this crisis in the past 2 years, we have seen a lot of voices in the media and in politics for their own selfish reasons hacking at the basic stability of the United States, trying to destroy the ability or interfere with the ability of the system to solve problems. And these terrible events have cast a spotlight that has, I think, reminded a lot of people who talk very loud that the country wants its institutions to work. The country wants results. The country does not want anger. When we're not looking, there are a lot of incentives, if you're talking to niche markets of 1 million people or 2 million people, to play this game. But when the whole country is looking, that's not the way it wants to go. The country is politically stable. And when people worry about the competition from China, I think that's very real. But I had a chance to spend a fair amount of time in China just this past year, and everybody in a position of leadership I met was worried about the country exploding. They were worried about revolution, and for a lot of excellent reasons that they had those worries. And that is not something that we need to worry about, because this political system is stable, and those who tamper with that stability do so ultimately at their peril.
John, Chair, before I come to Ariana, you want to say something?
Well, now I have a lot to say, but no. I think the point about education is right on. I was hoping that we get to a point of, forget about the definition of greatness for a second. So how do we compete in the future in this very global world? And everybody wants to compete, and the barrier, if you use the technology or internet, the barrier of competing has been lower. Everybody knows that. And so the number, Maria talked about the numbers, the mathematics of the people. I actually think it's because we spend so much money per person, per child in this country, educating them, but we're not getting the results. I think we need to go within that part first. Because the only thing that I think is in our attitudes. Because I always thought about, people always tell me about K to 12, and then they always talk about university. We have the best university system in the world, bar none. And then we don't have a good K to 12. And then the question is why? And the why is actually simple. In my mind, simple. Our attitude is we will not fail our child when they come from K to 12. But when they get to university, we will flunk them. You think about this. Because, you know, I kind of listen to other people, you know, the parents in this country will complain about their teachers when their child get flunked or whatever it's called, failed. Okay? And they don't take a lot of responsibility, in my mind. But in the university, everybody assumed that you are grown up and you could deal with it. See, in this culture, because I grew up in Hong Kong, I went to school in Hong Kong, and failure is not an option. I mean, I could go through the entire system for you. And because it was British rule at the time, and there are more kids than schools, we all have to fight into moving up. And so we study 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. In addition to that, we go to tutoring classes and try to do math on our own and see how many math you could do per hour. The attitude of this country is very different about this. You know, I ask my children. So I ask my kids sometimes, you know, Thanksgiving is coming. I say, you know what, if you do your homework the first couple of days, then you could really enjoy the rest of the weekend. And he looks at me and say, what homework? My teacher said we ought to relax. I'm not making it up. I'm not making it up. I'm not going to tell you the school district either. But it is that attitudinal thing that we ought to focus on. If we really want to compete, we ought to tell our kids, you have to learn and you have to excel, because, by the way, it's not about China, it's not about South Korea, it's not about Singapore, Taiwan, Japan. It's Sweden, it's France, it's Germany, it's everybody. It's not just China.
Yeah.
I actually really agree with David that every problem has the solution inside it. And we can sit here and talk exactly about how we can fix education. We can go to Harlem and look at what Jeffrey Canada has done and know how to fix education. We can go to the SID school here in Washington and know how we can fix education. The problem is that we have a completely dysfunctional political system. And the way our bipartisan system fixed education was the Leave No Child Behind Act that had everybody behind it, from George Bush to Ted Kennedy. And it did not fix the education system. On the contrary, it was one of the reasons why people are turning on government, because so many efforts, like the effort to fix education, like the bailout of Wall Street, have ended basically betraying the American middle class and betraying the working poor. I mean, look at the deal that Warren Buffett made with Goldman Sachs, and look at the deal that the American government on behalf of the American taxpayer made with Goldman Sachs, and you're going to be angry, whether you're right-wing or left-wing or anywhere, because our government failed us. I'm not saying they shouldn't have bailed out Wall Street. I'm saying that they should have bailed out Wall Street with strings attached. Otherwise, but again, I have many friends of mine who are really good capitalists, who sleep with a copy of Ayn Rand's Fountainhead under their pillow. And they're appalled at what happened, because that's not how the capitalist system is supposed to operate. You take excessive risk, you take the wrong decisions, and you go bankrupt. If you're too big to fail and you're going to be salvaged by the hardworking American taxpayer, what are you giving back?
Well,
Yeah.
Tavis,
And that's really, and to go back to David's point, this is fundamentally a moral issue. You know, the founders of capitalism, Adam Smith, when I studied economics at Cambridge, we studied Adam Smith. The first book he wrote, before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, was The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Everyone who's really at the source of the capitalist system knows you cannot have a thriving capitalist system without a moral foundation. And that's really what is missing right now. That's what it needs to be recreated.
There are a number of issues that are jumping off here, and it's getting fun as I knew it would. I want to come back to you, Dana, and just put two things out, and you can go wherever you want to go, because we'll get to all of this, trust me, in the 2.5 hours we have left here, 2 hours we have left here. But I want to combine, if I can, what John Chen said and what Ariana said, that we are in need, John Chen suggests, of an attitude adjustment in this country about education and other issues. And part of our problem right now in this country on a number of issues is that we need an attitude adjustment. I wonder, one, whether or not you think he's right about the fact that we need an attitude adjustment. And to Ariana's point, Ariana suggests that there are a lot of people turning on government. A lot of folk turning on government. Is the attitude of turning on government these days a justifiable attitude to have?
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does, and I think Ariana hit it just right, and I want to amplify that point here. And let's start by saying I think there's more agreement here than people may realize. I don't think there's anybody on this stage who quarrels with the notion of American exceptionalism, that this is the greatest country on earth, or in Dr. West's case, the least terrible country on earth. Yet at the same time, it's the same thing, right? But at the same time, we have a crisis of confidence. Now, where is this coming from? Yes, we have some of the worst schools, some of the worst education systems in the world. We also have some of the best, even at the K-12 level. We know how to do these things. I think we realize we have the potential within us, but we're stuck, morally or otherwise constipated. And why is that? And I think that was the point that Ariana just hit. There is a sense, the correct sense, I think, that our government is broken. It is not worthy of the people it is serving right now. And that's not a criticism of the 535 of them up there on Capitol Hill, although they deserve some of that. But that there's a sense, almost a fear, almost a panic that this system that was set up more than 200 years ago is no longer working, that we just cannot address the real problems of...
But here's why I don't get that, though, Dana. I don't get that because we, given our American exceptionalism and our patriotism and, for some of us, our nationalism and our arrogance and hubris, we're the ones always talking about exporting democracy around the world. So if our system is fundamentally broken, as you and Ariana are arguing, why then do we keep suggesting that everybody ought to be a democracy like us?
Because there's nothing better than that.
Than our broken system?
Than our broken system. We have the best darn broken system
Tavis, can I jump in here?
in the whole wide world.
I think part of the issue is the short-term mentality.
Yes.
We're so focused on, I want it yesterday, I want it tomorrow. We're focused on getting reelected. This is also combining what's wrong with the political system, because decisions are being made based on, will I get elected in 2 years? Will I get reelected in 4 years? By the way, the Chinese are thinking about the next 100 years, not the next 2 years. And I think that is part of the crux of the issue.
David?
And Tavis, I would also suggest that what we're seeing right now is a vehement discussion in this country as it relates to free market principles versus big government intrusion. I mean, this is what the birth of the Tea Party, if you will, the way they see it put on by not just the Obama administration, but Bush before him. So, I would just suggest that, one of the things that if you're going to win the argument of ideas, you have to engage with people that don't agree with you. And therefore, I go back to 2007 when you had your debate at Morgan State University, where John McCain was a no-show. Rudy Giuliani was a no-show. Mitt Romney was a no-show. If you're going to say that free market principles are the answer, then you need to go in front of audiences that may not necessarily agree with that, or that hasn't worked for them in the past. And I think that's part of the problem here.
Can I just jump in? Wait, I think and David, I think this is where I disagree. I think one of the reasons that we are where we are is because of the massive deregulation that happened since the 1980s, and all of a sudden it came up to us. And what happened is that when government wasn't watching, we worked at our worst instinct, which was we got greedy. People who had no business getting 1 or 2 homes all of a sudden signed that dotted line, not completely understanding that all of a sudden they weren't paying necessarily their mortgage, they were just paying their interest. So all of a sudden they're paying $2,000 a month and they had a nice little house, and all of a sudden 5 years later kicked in and the APR came up, and all of a sudden they're paying $5,000 a month. How are they going to reconcile that? And that had a lot to do with deregulation. And I do think that what we're finding right now as a government, and I think when we're talking about democracy and democracy building, is that what we forget is that democracy, American democracy, is evolving. We evolved with the women's suffrage. We talked about it. We continued to climb when we did the civil rights movement. And now our biggest principle right now, our biggest challenge, I think, is how do we continue moving that forward? But there is a place for government. And it bothers me because there's one reason why, DC doesn't do it so well, but there's a reason why someone plows our snow. There's a reason why someone, gives me public transportation. That's a government function, but also why the lights turn on when I need them to. And I think we have to make sure that government is not all at fault. There is a place for government, and it's important to make sure that we recognize that and embrace it.
There's a difference between the state government and the federal government, and I think that's part of what we're talking about here. And so I think that debate has to go forward. But look, this is why the Tea Party was so successful, because it was a cauldron, if you will, of everything that they believed that the Constitution, that wasn't being lived up to as it relates to the Constitution.
At the heart, there's just one quick thing about the Tea Party, because it's really important. At the heart of the Tea Party anger, if you look at any survey, is anger at the bailout. Before there was anger at healthcare, before there was anger at anything else, there is anger at the fact that basically in this country, we went from a country that makes things to a country that makes things up. CDOs, credit default swaps, toxic derivatives, and when all that house of cards collapses, the taxpayer, the government bails them out. That is really still at the heart of what went wrong. And the fact that every day we get great news from Wall Street and bad news from Main Street is basically fueling that very legitimate anger. And we need to address it. We cannot really go forward in a way that will rebuild our communities and rebuild the country if we don't address that with a sense of urgency that has really been missing. I'd love Maria to talk to that, because when Wall Street was in danger, there was an unbelievable sense of urgency. Everybody came together with that famous weekend, our financial establishments, our political establishments, and they basically said, we don't know exactly how we're going to prevent this from happening, but we know we cannot afford to let the financial system collapse. So we'll throw everything against the wall, and they saved it, and rightly so. We never had that sense of urgency about jobs. We never had that sense of urgency about foreclosure. And that's what's missing.
I want to come to Dr. West in just a second on this. But David, since you mentioned this twice now, and I know that you have covered this organization, this group, these people as well, or certainly as much as anybody else over the last year or so, and that is this whole Tea Party movement. I'm curious from your perspective whether or not there is something, whether we like or loathe, agree or disagree with the Tea Party. They made some noise last year and got a few people elected and got a whole lot of media time on outlets all across this country. Is there something to learn? Is there any takeaway that you think we ought to wrestle with from the Tea Party relative to writing the next chapter in America?
Well, absolutely. I think first of all, what you saw politically in 2010 was just Act 1. Act 2 is coming in 2012. These folks are serious, and they've got good hearts. There's no doubt about it. But they were starting to work the day after the election on 2012. So we're in the beginning of a process here as it relates to the Tea Party. I would just suggest this, that one of the reasons Marco Rubio did so well in 2010 and became a U.S. Senator in Florida is because he articulated the message very well. Christine O'Donnell did not. Both Tea Party candidates, both with essentially the same message. But Marco Rubio was able to explain some common sense items. For example, read the bill, read the congressional bill, cite the constitutional authority in the bill, term limits, a balanced budget amendment. If you line 10 people up on the street, these are some pretty common sense principles, if you will. This is what Marco Rubio did. Rand Paul did it in Kentucky. They ran textbook campaigns. The point is this. The Tea Party message is one that can resonate, but it needs the right messenger. And I think what we saw in 2010 is a couple of messengers that were able to convince independents and people that might not buy into a Tea Party message to begin with to come on into their side.
We may get back to that. I want to go to Ariana's point now. The point you made and ask Dr. West to comment on it. I've heard 2 or 3 references now, and nobody has said it, so I'm going to say it. We're going to wrestle with it.
Yeah.
But I've heard 2 or 3 references now to policies or the lack thereof that we have been subjected to in the first 2 years of President Obama's first term. One of the things, there are any number of things, but one of the things that makes this conversation so, the timing at least, so propitious tonight is that we are just days away from the anniversary of the halfway point. I shouldn't say the anniversary, but days away from the halfway point of the first term of President Barack Obama. So I suspect in the coming days, there'll be a lot of analysis about how he has done at the halfway point of his first term, what these next 2 years are going to bring, how he's going to deal with this divided government. And a lot of this, I suspect, is going to be laid out in his State of the Union speech, which we expect to be happening literally days from now as well. So since Ariana has offered at least 2 or 3 indictments of policies or the lack thereof so far, but we haven't said it expressly, let's talk, Dr. West, about the fact that we are at the halfway point of the president's first term. And generally speaking, broadly speaking, you say what about that?
I would say that when we look at the major priorities of our beloved president's first 2 years, we don't see the priority of poor and working people. He chose Tim Geithner, deregulator, Larry Summers, deregulator, Kep Bernanke, deregulator. These are all either recycled Clintonites or Bushites. But this is not the change we can believe in. You see it? Now, what happened? Well, we don't know. We can't read our dear brother's soul. But, and I support him critically, because it's not about him in the end. It's not about me. It's about poor and working people. That's what the legacy of Martin is all about, you see. Now, what does that mean? It meant then that it became very clear, if you can get bailouts of $1 trillion, we can eliminate poverty with billions. $1 trillion to a small group of bankers. It's clear that pro-business, big business, not small business, not entrepreneurs who are out there struggling, huge business. And so the Tea Party comes along once he brings in his pro-Wall Street people with a populist message. I think populism can be a good thing when it focuses on poor and working people. They have populist gestures. There's corruption in the government. They're right about that. The U.S. government is corrupt. There's no doubt about that. The lobbyists are there. The corporate influence is there. The private contractors with military-industrial complexes there. The corruption is there. But they respond to government by being anti-government across the board. We say, no, we got to democratize the government. You got to clean it up to the degree to which poor people and working people have access to governmental position and power in the same way our investment bankers, same way our insurance companies, huge insurance companies do. So it's a pseudo-populist movement. And then it's also got an element of white backlash because of Barack Obama and Michelle and the children. So it's very much a lily white affair. It's more like the National Hockey League than the NBA, you know what I mean? In terms of its racial composition. That doesn't mean it's all racist, but there's racist elements there because most right-wing populist movements in America tend to be xenophobic, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic. We may have seen that with our dear sister Sarah Palin the other day. Either that was ignorance or a subtle anti-Semitic gesture. We don't know. But blood libel is something you don't use. You don't use that with Jewish brothers and sisters. You see what I mean? So that the problem was we had a moment with Barack Obama's presidency. If he could bring in economists who focus on homeowners rather than just the bankers, to focus on working people rather than the elites, we would have had a very different moment, and maybe the Tea Party movement would have been nipped in the bud.
But actually, just very quickly, I would like to disagree with my brother here.
Oh, indeed.
because I don't really see racism in the Tea Party movement any more than there is racism in... Hold on a second.
Let me second that.
Hold on a second.
No, let her finish. So let's just say Ariana.
You know, there is racism, there are tinges of racism in every part of American society. There are vestiges of racism everywhere. What fuels the Tea Party movement is not racism. And if you believe that, you are wrong, and you should look at the data. What fuels the Tea Party movement is anger at the fact that the game is rigged. That basically, if you are a member of the elites, you can do no wrong. No matter how many times you fail, you're going to be bailed out. If you're a poor or a middle-class person, you make one mistake, even if that means that credit card companies are going to use usury rates on your credit cards, 29, 30%, even if it means that there is going to be hidden stuff in your mortgage contract, that unless, as Elizabeth Warren says, you're a Harvard law professor and you can't understand it, the game is rigged against you if you're a member of the middle class or the working poor, but not if you're a member of the elites. That's what's fueling the Tea Party movement. And it's very important to have the correct diagnosis if we're going to proceed correctly. And the focus on what the coach money is doing and what the few racist elements are doing is not really where the heart of the problem is. And the anger is not just with the Tea Party. The anger is widespread all across America. And it's very significant that we address it, because otherwise it gets out of control. And when it gets out of control, the stable system that David is celebrating can get destabilized.
And let me just suggest,
it's also...
My claim was not that it was fueled solely by racism. I said there's a racist element.
But there's
it's
a
fueled
racist
by
element
anti-government sentiment.
Everywhere. There's a racist
Well,
element
no, it's not everywhere. No, it's not everywhere.
I also feel, Ariana, that part of the boost...
I don't see those ugly pictures of Obama coming out of the Tea Party movement in other movements. I don't see it. So that element is there.
There's also the fuel, part of the fuel for the Tea Party, I think, is the idea that there's a movement that people want their freedoms and do not want to feel like things are being forced upon them, or, for example, I think it was healthcare passage. And I think when you looked at the polls and you looked at sort of the feeling of America, there was a majority that didn't necessarily want that particular plan passed. Many people will say, this is actually not health care, but health insurance. And we're not necessarily dealing with the issues of obesity. Michelle certainly is, for sure, but we're not dealing with the crux of health care. Another thing I have to add here, because there's, once again, the divisions, I think it's very important to remember the business of Wall Street, because Wall Street and Main Street, no matter how much we say Wall Street versus Main Street, are connected. When you want the bridge built in your neighborhood, the financing comes from Wall Street. And so it's not just a bunch of guys, and by the way, I'm not saying that there weren't massive, greedy situations where there were a bunch of guys walking home with hundreds of millions of dollars, but let's be fair and clear and accurate. Wall Street and Main Street are connected, and they always have been.
But I think the point Dr. West was raising and others have raised, and let me put it as a question to you, since you cover this every day. Wall Street and Main Street may be connected, but one always gets the priority. Why does one always get treated? Why does the elite always get the priority over the other?
Well, it's a fair question. It's a fair question.
I'm just saying.
I think that there are small businesses. The story of America is the story of entrepreneurialism and the story of people, as I mentioned earlier, beginning with nothing and working hard, having a good idea, innovating, getting the financing from a lender, whether it's, not all the banks are big, the big 5 banks. And there are banks and there are lenders that are catering to small business, entrepreneurs, and I think that is the beauty of America, and that's what we need to protect.
But
and
that's
so
but that's not what we are talking about when we talk about Wall
But we
Street.
should be talking about that.
No, absolutely. We launched a movement called Move Your Money, where we actually encourage people to move their money from the 5 big banks to small community banks and credit unions that are much more likely to reinvest in their communities, to reinvest in small businesses. And I completely agree with you, Maria. The problem is that there's been a decoupling between the financial sector and the real economy. And that's what is so dangerous, because that decoupling has meant that instead of the financial sector enabling businesses, which is at the heart of the job creation, they've basically been running a casino. And they've been running a casino where if you lose, the taxpayer will bail you out. And it's not just the bailout, it's Ben Bernanke, the Fed now. You can go to the window at the Fed and get 0% financing. And instead of investing in small businesses, they're basically investing, continuing to invest in buying toxic derivatives, in doing all that stuff that was happening before. It's still going on. And we still have too big to fail. We have not ended it despite the much vaunted financial regulation, and that's the problem.
John Chen, Maria and Ariana are in a good conversation here. Let me pull you into this, because it is one thing, you know, and everybody, politicians tend to do this. It's easy to give lip service to the power and the necessity of small business in this country. But again, that's not the picture we've seen painted for the last couple of years. The big businesses got bailed out, the small ones didn't. Your business isn't exactly a small business in Silicon Valley, but talk to me about this abandonment, quite frankly, of small business by this country, particularly as we try to write this next chapter.
Can I just add one thing? Because when you're talking about a large bank, some of the customers of the large banks are the states, are the sovereigns. I mean, so it's not just big customers or the customers of big banks. I've got to add that.
John.
Yeah, first of all, we're a business that didn't need to be bailed out.
Make that clear.
Make that clear.
Make that clear.
That's important.
That's exactly right.
I actually thought, while you guys are talking, and I could see the passion on both ends, and I was sitting there thinking, you know, two things. One is, we talk about given it time. Clearly, our system, only after 200 years, had some imperfectness to it, right? And we all agree that this is the least imperfect system, therefore the greatest system. Right? We all agree with that. I mean, and that's not joking. I mean, it is true. Okay, so it is at least the most free, but there has been some consequences. I think there is a lot of greed, one better. The short-termness of the Wall Street, the short-termness of the investors, and then the leveraging of everything that had created, you know, the structural issues. Because of that, big does matter, or size does matter. Big does have advantage, and therefore we tend to, unfortunately, not pay enough attention to the small and protect the small. However, when I thought about, we always preach free market principles. We always preach, let the market choose the winner. And in a global environment like this, there really do need some governing protection of the small business and the nurturing of small business. We don't have that because it's somewhat anti our basic market principle. Otherwise, we'll be in there trying to dictate who wins, who loses in certain ways. So, I mean, unfortunately, the effect seems like the small isn't taken care of. But we need, if we want to do that, and we probably should, then we need some policy changes from the government.
Speaking of policy changes.
But Ariana's point was that even given the ordinary rules of capitalism, if a bank is too big to fail, then it's not subject to market discipline because government comes in. And you look at the juxtaposition, 1996, Bill Clinton, playing his saxophone, signed a scandalous welfare bill that Ronald Reagan wouldn't sign. But he did it to triangulate for political purposes. It was opportunistic. 2 years later, they bailed out a hedge fund, long-term capital. Government came in and saved them. So poor folk out here having nothing, calling for help. No, personal responsibility. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Hedge fund, lost, failed, gets welfare. There's a hypocrisy here. So that even too big to fail many times, I mean, you know, Joseph Stiglitz makes this point in Free Fall, Chapter 5, American Great Robbery, right?
Right, okay.
That, and he's right about this. Too big to fail really means so much political influence that they can get what they want.
See,
that's what that means. No, was I too harsh, you think, brother?
No, no.
Okay.
I do have to respectfully disagree in the sense,
Yes.
if the view of when I look at too big to fail today, is because if we make them fail, and I'm not suggesting it's right, wrong, and different, okay? If we make them fail, the structural damages to our system hurt the little guy. Okay, so I think the government here in this town aren't exactly, I mean, they may not be the most effective, they certainly aren't stupid. I hope.
But you can downsize. You can downsize. Just downsize.
I got it. You could deregulate it, or you could split it apart and make it smaller. I got it. But who is to say that that won't happen in the next couple of years? I'm not suggesting it is. I'm not in government. But I think that might be a good formula. That may encourage smaller entrepreneur that makes the size come. I'm not advocating it. I'm not suggesting I know anything.
John,
because I'm going to get killed by other people when I walk out here.
John,
so anyway, call my lines.
Let me ask one more question. There's some other topics we want to get to, obviously, tonight, and our time is going faster than I thought. But let me ask you one other question while you're talking. So we referenced earlier that Hu Jintao is on his way to the USA for a few days next week. What ought we, the American people, expect our government to get for us out of those conversations? What ought they be bringing back to us when this summit is over?
Open the market over there. Let us play evenly, fairly, and transparently.
Stop stealing our software.
Sounds like
or stop stealing everything. Okay, and by the way, it goes both ways.
Yeah.
If you're a foreign entity and you want to invest in any company in the United States, if you're the Chinese today, you feel very unwelcomed. And it ties to our CFIUS process. It ties to some level of, I wouldn't say discrimination, but distinction, fear, mistrust, distrust on our part. And it goes into the core of the immigration and everything else surrounding that. I think our country needs to rethink how to create jobs here. And China is investing, I know it's off topic a little bit, but China is investing about $100 billion a year, United States dollars a year, in the direct foreign investment. We at this country are getting like 3 or 4% of that. It is totally not acceptable.
When you started your answer by saying, you said very quickly, without hesitation, open the markets. My friend from CNBC, Maria Bartiromo, whispered in my ear, impossible.
I said it sounds like an impossible.
You want to expand on that? Yeah.
Yes, because I think exactly what John is saying is where the rubber meets the road. And let's talk some specific examples. Recently, we had tires coming from China, and they were being sold at very low levels, or cheaper than American companies' tires. And so there was a big outcry from workers. Why are Americans buying those tires and not the tires that we make in this country? Well, they're cheaper. So how do we, we put tariffs. We're putting higher tariffs on the tires coming into this country to make them more expensive so that we're making money on it. And the Chinese say, well, if you're going to put tariffs on that, then we're not going to have you sell products to our people. And what I mentioned earlier is critical. 1.3 billion people, 300 million people.
Right.
Our companies need to sell to those emerging middle class. And we need to come to an agreement here in order to prosper all of us. And by the way, on the too big to fail, for me, I don't think it's necessarily too big to fail, that's the issue, but too connected to fail.
I see.
Big companies are not necessarily evil. It's if you're connected all over the world. Who knew AIG was ensuring everything that when the lights went out, the financial system would dry up? Another conversation, I'm sorry.
No, but while you're talking, though, how afraid then, let's be blunt about it, how afraid then, you've made this point 3 times, how afraid then, given the numbers, given this imbalance in this equation, how afraid, how scared should we be of China and, for that matter, India as well?
I'm not afraid. I don't think we should be afraid.
You just said the numbers don't work out, Maria.
Because we have to sell to those people. Multinational companies have to be able to sell American products. We need to manufacture products in this country and sell them all over the world. And that's where policy comes in. We need a policy in place that keeps some manufacturing and some jobs, the good jobs, the jobs we want here. If a company can do something cheaper in India, it's going to do it, and it should do it to stay competitive.
So John, tell me then why we should be hopeful then, given this difficult, I'll use that word, given the difficulty of this proposition. Why then should the American people, as we write this next chapter, be hopeful that we can play on a level playing field with China?
Okay, so let me first answer, because this points have been bouncing back and forth a few times, and Maria likes to use 300 million versus 1.3 billion, and that's a good number, and I'm not concerned at all about that. I'm very fortunate that I come from a technology field, and I'm very fortunate I came from Silicon Valley. So if you look at a Silicon Valley productivity number, it's about 8 times better than any part in the world, on average. And therefore, I could overwhelm that 300 million versus 1.3 billion if we innovate. Okay, absolutely. Innovation gets you the margin dollars. Now, that ties to my earlier thing.
Absolutely, I agree.
That ties to my earlier thing. We have to have an education system, we have to have the immigration system to grab the best so that we can innovate.
But there's one element missing.
Can I jump in very briefly? I think one of the things that we're missing too is that it's the American culture, right? What do we export? And people want to emulate Hollywood, music. And I think that is one of our strengths that no one's talking about when we start saying, are we going to be competitive with China? And yes, India, who has a Bollywood industry. But at the end of the day, it's our differences and our cultural differences and our strength in our Hollywood that we've actually been able to use as soft power to change the hearts and minds of people worldwide.
But you're not suggesting we're going to act and dance our way out of this, though, are you?
No. But it is an industry. No.
I don't dance so well.
But it is an industry that we've actually been able to sell of what it means to be rich, what it means to be to the next generation. Does that make sense? I mean, it's
well, they have to play by the rules. They have to play by the rules and not copy our stuff.
Right. That's a difference. That's copyright.
David, I'll come back.
If the good people at Nationwide would give you a grant to do a show on China's next chapter, and if that were allowed on Chinese TV, and if the people participated were not terrified to discuss the truth, the answers would terrify the audience. I think we should be much more afraid for China than afraid of them. Compared to their problems, our problems are molehills, and that is something that they are very conscious of, and we should not lose sight that from their unfree press, from their unfree discussion, from their propagandistic media, from their neglect of their countryside and overinvestment in skyscrapers and high-speed trains and things we see, we should not forget there are 500 million people living in the Chinese countryside who are living. The problem is not just that they are very poor. The problem is they are increasingly impatient. When you look at the history of this country, the Great Migration of black farmers from the south of the United States. I'm going to remember at the top of my head how many people that was who moved between 1917.
Millions.
Maybe 3 million people?
Yes,
maybe 4 million people.
Yes.
There are 500 million people in the Chinese countryside. Now think of the social upheaval that migration created in the United States, the resentment between groups and groups, how difficult it was to work out, how we're still not working it out, how whole cities collapsed underneath that transformation. Now imagine doing it times 100. Or actually 150. That's their problem. We don't have that problem. We have our problems. Our problems, I so wholeheartedly agree with those who said, I think Ariana said this and others, that our problems are a dysfunctional political system that prevents our extraordinarily strong and powerful economy and society from responding. And let me just say one thought about that. I am personally haunted by something that Tip O'Neill, the former speaker, said when he left Congress. He served a third of a century, from the early 1950s to the middle 1980s. And at the end of his career, he was asked, how had Congress changed in his time? And he said, the people are better, the results are worse. And that is true again and again through so much of the federal government. That whatever you think of your member of Congress, they are, as compared to them half a century ago, more honest, more hardworking, more sober.
How do you measure that, Toby?
Just ask around. Ask around. They don't have their wives and girlfriends on the payroll anymore. That kind of thing has just stopped. But if you then talk to them about the subjective experience of being a member of Congress, they are constantly frustrated. They can't get things done. And everything they do to make the system work better, but they constantly say, well, let's give more power to the members, which enhances the number of people who are able to prevent things from being done. And the result is completely frustrating.
Here's my problem. I'm going to come to Ariana because she, again, wrote the book about this. The problem is, and I think this may be, I've been trying to keep track of the things that we do agree on so far on this panel, and we haven't even gotten to this multi-ethnic, multicultural, multiracial conversation, which I promise we're going to get to, or the lack thereof in this country. But I think the one thing so far that we all agree on is that our government is broken. Our system of government is broken. Anybody disagree with that so far? All right. It's the one thing we basically tend to agree on, that we got a broken system that somehow needs to be fixed. Ariana, if that's the problem, how do we fix it?
Well, what David said is absolutely true, that the problem with the current elected officials is that there are 26 lobbies for each member of Congress, 26 lobbyists. That means, on top of everything else, that while we're sitting here maybe celebrating the passage of financial reform, they're there undermining it. So by the time financial reform is enacted, it will bear very little relation to what we celebrated. And we saw that again and again. We saw that in every disaster this year. We saw it in the BP disaster. We saw it in the mining disaster. All the loopholes that had been introduced that made it possible to have what's known as regulatory capture. So it's not really about whether we have regulations or don't have regulations. It's the fact that we can have regulations up the gazoo and they don't work if we don't have a functional system. And on top of it, you know, when you mentioned earlier about the fact that America has traditionally been amazing in terms of using soft power, well, right now, China is getting better at it. I mean, look at Afghanistan. We are spending over $100 billion there pursuing an immoral and unnecessary and unwinnable war. And China is spending billions of dollars buying raw material for its industry. Who do you think is going to win that battle? So we have this kind of perverted priorities across our system. And again, this is a completely beyond left and right consensus that is emerging. And that's one of the most promising things. You had Grover Norquist yesterday, hardly a lefty, hardly a peacenik, coming out against the Afghanistan war. You have more and more Republican members now asking for real oversight as to how this money is being spent. The good thing to come out of WikiLeaks was a very clear chronicling of the corruption that's going on, of the fact that taxpayer money is being completely wasted while we are cutting vital social services here at home.
Let me ask Dana right quick. Dana's been quiet for a minute here. I know he's got a lot to say. He's been thinking a lot. There are two questions I want to ask you, Dana, and they're disconnected. I want to get both of them out now so you take your time and unpack them as you see fit. In no particular order, number one, to this point about our system being broken, you're the one person on this panel who lives here, who covers this broken.
Yeah,
exactly. David's well. Yeah. But you, and for the Washington Post at least, the people in this audience read your stuff every week. You cover this broken system, as it were, all the time. How do you go about covering? How do you remain hopeful about a system that's broken? Number one. Then I want to ask a question specific about Ariana's point about Afghanistan and Iraq. But answer that first question first.
Well, I mean, I'm sort of a counter indicator. I mean, if this government were working very well, I might be out of a job. I exist to point out what's wrong with our government. Now, that I take that deal. I could find another line of work. Maybe I could get something on Wall Street. So I would take that deal. But my job is to point out what's wrong and why things are going off as badly as they are. And I think we've actually identified that fairly easily here. And it was the same thing that was your question to Maria earlier. Why is Wall Street always in line before Main Street? The same thing that Ariana was talking about here, and the same thing that's inspiring the Tea Party is there's a sense that our government has been sold to the highest bidder. And this was a this was a problem with why it was asleep before the financial crisis. The Tea Party was so upset with the way the elites were governing the country that they forced a change. Well, guess what? They've been had. 13 of the new Republican freshmen in the House have hired lobbyists as their chief of staff. They've been having fundraisers all over town, raking in money from lobbyists. A lobbyist is John Boehner's new policy director. A lobbyist is now running health care on the Commerce Committee. They don't just run for election every 2 years. They run for election perpetually. And they're perpetually doing whatever it takes to get these required contributions. This isn't a Republican thing. It's not a Democratic thing, and that gets to why the system is broken. Now, this is great business for me, selfishly. So, I can watch all this, venality and bad behavior and, people breaking their principles to raise a buck. But that's both the source of my enjoyment and the source of the problem.
I think it's very important.
But for me, the crucial question is about, given this corruption, politicians, perennial fundraisers, looking to big business and big banks and others for their money, hence corporate influence, hence big financial influence on big government, incompetence in big government, greed, not among all of us are human beings and partly greedy, but concentrated greed with consequences for them. Who pays the cost? Invisible. Now, I think here, history is very important. We can talk about America all we want, right? The U.S. Constitution was in place for over 89 years, but slavery was still in place. In practice, it was a pro-slavery document, and there's no reference to slavery in the U.S. Constitution. And this is very important for immigrants who just got here. This is very important. You're not going to come into America with all of this robust opportunity and mobility without understanding the history and the degree to which this marvelous Constitution, which was marvelous precisely because Americans had the courage to make it more free and democratic by abolishing slavery, then here comes Jim Crow. That was American terrorism. That was another 90 years, right? But it was invisible. So then we have to raise ourselves, well, what is invisible today? Have we seen the prison-industrial complex? The 2.5 million fellow citizens locked in? Have you seen the children locked into not just the schools, but the quality of their souls? Who's paying the cost when we talk about all of this corruption at the top? And that's why I have I'm hesitant in terms of the excessive celebration. I do agree with the fluidity and possibility and so forth, but when I look who's paying the cost, no serious talk about that in the halls of power. Why? The will of the people is suppressed owing to the oligarchs and the plutocrats on top.
So speaking of, one second. So Dan, I did not forget the second question I wanted to ask you, and Dr. West gives me a great segue.
I'm sorry to jump in.
That's fine. Your segue and your setup was nice. I can go right back to Dana. Doc is talking about now, as he should, about who pays the cost.
Yeah.
The second question I want to ask you was disconnected, but now I think we can connect it. What is the price? What is the cost that we ultimately pay being tied to this ongoing war in Afghanistan, being tied to this ongoing war in Iraq? We now know this is the longest military excursion this country has ever endured, Afghanistan rather. What is the price that we ultimately pay relative to trying to write this next chapter if we can't tear ourselves away from either or both of these wars long term?
Well, beyond the immediate cost, of course, is the problem that the spending on the wars has created this sort of Me Too situation. So anybody can now say, well, you can pay for what I want to do, or you can pay afford this tax cut because we're able to afford so many hundreds of billions of dollars for wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So the problem is compounded. Now everybody's saying, since we could run these wars without paying for them, well, heck, we can do all kinds of other things, $13 trillion worth of debt without paying for them. But I think the corrosion has gone beyond the money in this case. And I think one of the real problems with the wars is that we were never asked to sacrifice for them. I'm not speaking in terms of taxes, but America, a very small sliver of America has anything to do with these wars. And I think one of my pet projects all along has been some sense of national service, some sense of sacrifice, some sense that we're in this all together. You won't hear a thing about it in the Congress right now or anywhere in this town, but there's a sense that war is detached and over there. There's no sense, as there was famously in the Second World War, that we are all in this together, and that's led to all these problems in all of the rest of our culture, too.
David Brody, you had something?
Yeah, well, just 2 quick points. I mean, I think this is actually a place, even though the nation is split on Afghanistan, ideologically, there's a lot of common ground on this issue. In other words, you have liberals and conservatives agreeing many, many times on what to do in Afghanistan. So, I mean, I just think that's an interesting dynamic in all of this. I mean, you can put liberals and conservatives together, and they'll say, look, we need to get out. Or you can put liberals and conservatives together and say we need to stay. So I don't think there's one big happy answer here. Real quick on politics and how to fix this. This was your original question, how to fix government, if you will. Look, I mean, I think the simple answer, and I know it's simple, but there is something about this, which is if you're going to drink the Potomac water, drink it quick and get out. In other words, term limits and this whole idea of power corrupts, corruption and power together. It's too much. Here in D.C., it's way too much. You got to get in and get out. And I think that is a big part of what's going on here. And I think that's, in terms of fixing the problem, this is what the Tea Party, to a degree, was about, getting these citizen legislators. There is a movement called Get Out of Our House in this country. It's called GOOH, G-O-O-O-H. And it's a bunch of community forums all across this country electing 535 folks to the House of Representatives. It's small, it's in its infancy, but the point is it's going back to the grassroots of getting citizen legislators in there and going from there instead of politicians that have been drinking the Potomac way too much.
I want to ask Ariana something right quick. Before I do, I've been dying to ask you this one question again because we've been friends for a while and you've covered this more than anybody. But just so I understand this, y'all forgive me, it's just a personal moment. I just need to understand this. When the Tea Party says we're going to take our country back, from whom? I just don't. I mean, seriously. You just ran all the time. We're going to take our country back. Seriously, from whom?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
What it means is we're going to take our country back to first principles. We're going to take our country back to a constitutional view of what they really do believe, what the Constitution requires in this country, or what it says. And so really, it's not take our country back in terms of, let's pack some heat and let's go. I mean, that's not what this is about at all. And getting back to a point, Dr. West, that you made earlier, I think there's a danger in saying when you use the race, you or anybody, really anybody, use the racism word, even if you're not defining the Tea Party, which I don't think you were, but you were saying there was an element of racism to the Tea Party. And I can tell you, though, that inherent in that is a dismissive attitude towards the Tea Party because it's basically trying to not justify it and its existence and its power in this country because this is just the infancy.
Let me ask Dr. West.
I'm concerned about the truth.
Yeah, sure.
I don't want to dismiss anybody. I try to love everybody.
Now, I want to ask Paul.
I want to know whether it's true or not that there's a racism.
Well, I can tell you this on the truth factor. Yes. I mean, look, the media has gone out and tried to tell this story. I mean, clearly, we've seen it out there. And I have been to, I can't tell you, dozens and dozens of these Tea Party rallies across the country. And I got to tell you, the first thing I do when I go there, I'm listening. We record the audio. I can go back and listen to that, and I do. But I'm looking around the corner. I'm looking around the crowd.
Yes.
I got to tell you, it's not there. Now,
but how many black folk are at these meetings?
Well, yeah.
It doesn't necessarily make it racist that they're not there, but black folk are very intelligent. We're very intelligent. We get a sense of what's going on. But no, go right ahead.
But look, I mean, you know, there's people that I've talked to, the new Congressman Tim Scott, who's come in, you know, who's a Tea Party member. And
black guy from South Carolina.
Right.
Black Republican.
That's right.
B. Strom Thurmond's son.
That's right.
Yep. Got it. Okay, great.
All right. I actually attended. I actually attended one of his Tea Party events down in South Carolina in front of an all-white crowd of 55 plus, if you will, and he was beloved there. Because he's well, he was what? I've got the tape.
Beloved.
Beloved. I thought you said something else.
Oh, no. So he was beloved there. My point simply is that if you actually go and look at the story from an in-depth perspective, you know, a lot of these charges are really unfounded.
Yeah. Dana Milbank, then I want to ask all you on something.
Can I just to jump on?
Sure, right quick, come on.
No, I'll be probably for a longer conversation. Well, part of it is, I mean, you mentioned Scott, and I have to jump in because Scott hired a chief of staff who's incredibly anti-immigrant and anti-Latino. And
wait.
Looking,
hold on, let me make sure I get this right. So you got a new black congressman, a black man
who's
in
chief
Congress,
of staff, yes.
whose chief of staff is anti-immigrant.
Anti-immigrant.
I just want to make sure I heard that right. Okay, go ahead.
But you know, that's a label.
No, and the same thing happens. You mentioned Marco Rubio earlier. Marco Rubio was a Tea Party candidate. He was anti-English. He was English only, and then realized that his polls were going soft, and all of a sudden started moving away, and very anti-immigrant as well. And so he started moving away from the Tea Party, and all of a sudden started placing Spanish language ads. You can't have it both ways. And what happens is that when you start scratching the surface, you can demonstrate Engel. Sharon Engel was also a Tea Party candidate in Nevada. Every time she wanted to demonstrate that she was pro-America, safe borders, we all are for it, she showed working class immigrants basically being the next scary face of America. And that's a danger because words do have consequences. Arizona right now has become basically the radicalized right that all of a sudden has made it, it's a laboratory that made it okay to become mainstream. And all those testings and all those words, I know when someone comes in and shows a picture of Obama looking like the Joker, we all know what they're saying. It's not a wink. And I think there's a danger, and I'm not dismissing the Tea Party. When you look at the Tea Party, the majority of the Tea Party, and it may have changed, but the average Tea Party, the first folks that started, they were upper middle class, white male. Yeah. My father is a white male, so I have nothing against my dad, but it's recognizing that they, all of a sudden, the middle class white male felt disenfranchised. They felt that they had not marched during the civil rights movement, many of them because they were old-time vets and they were actually fighting, they were no longer. So they realized that this might be a movement for them to take their country back. America's changing. And when they say take the American back, is that they want the America that they grew up with, not recognizing.
David, now come back.
You know, I would just say this. I think we've come to a crux of the crux of the issue here.
Right.
One of the main ones, which is labels. You know, I think there's a lot of validity to what you just had to say. When you said that, you said anti-immigrant. And a lot of times we put people in a box. And I think that's extremely dangerous, and I think that's is not part of the solution.
But you can see, though, right quick.
Oh, sure.
I want to hear a response. But you will concede, though, David, that there is a distinct difference, though, between labels and facts. If the facts are what they are, that's not labeling, that's the fact.
Right, but there's a bigger picture, because people like myself and maybe David and Dana, you know, and others who go across this country and actually speak to these folks and listen to the 48-minute interview instead of the 14-second YouTube clip, have a much better sense of what, I don't want to say have a much better sense, but have a real bigger picture than just saying anti-immigrant. When you say anti-immigrant, I mean, those are pretty strong words, and I'm not suggesting that there wouldn't be a case, let me finish real quick. It wouldn't be just a case on your side, but there is a case on the other side. And my point here, the crux of the problem, is the labels, putting people in a box, and I think that that's very dangerous because it doesn't lead to conducive conversation.
Since you said, hold on. Since you said there is a point on the anti-immigrant side, that point would be what? You said there is a point on the other side of this debate. We know Maria's point of view. What is the other point?
I'm just simply saying, all I'm saying, Tavis, when I said that was when you say you're anti-immigrant, there's an inherent philosophy that comes with that.
Yes.
In other words, in other words, you're basically saying, I'm not saying you're saying this, but there is you're racist or you're, and listen, and then you're painting people a certain way and you haven't talked to them. You haven't listened to, it's true.
I think he has
So Maria, hold on. So
I mean.
So let me ask. So Maria, when you say then, this is a very, I like this, very serious.
This happens to conservative Christians.
This is very informative and instructive. So that, I hear David's point loud and clear. And part of what's wrong with America, David is right about this, is that in a lot of ways, there's too much labeling. It happens on both sides. There's too much, y'all can clap on that. I know I'm right about it. In America, there is too much labeling. You may disagree with him, you may disagree on this point that David Brody's making, but there is too much labeling in this country. So I want to get to the heart of this. When you say anti-immigrant, when you label someone on national TV as you just did, and you called them out almost by name, you gave their title. We could go online tonight and find out who's by name who you were talking about. When you call someone anti-immigrant on national TV, what do you mean by that?
First of all, I think that as a country, we're suffering from racial fatigue. We're afraid to talk about race, and when we get it too close, we don't want to bear that burden. Number one. When I say anti-immigrant, the young man in Arizona who saved Representative Gifford's life under SB 1070, he would have been asked for his papers just by the way he looked. And I have to tell you that that was a saddened moment for us with the work that we do. I mean, and we do go around the country talking to folks. I mean, we run a field operation across the country, and we knock on doors, and we're listening. And it was a sad day in America when SB 1070 passed, and there wasn't an outcry from America. Because for the very first time, we distinguished, once again, what America looked like based on your color of your skin. That legislation now has been gutted, but there are 22 other states introducing similar legislation where just by the fact that you may look like an undocumented individual, someone could ask you your papers. Shame on us, because there's not moral outcry on that.
Dana Milbank.
At some risk to my safety, I want to partially defend David on the Tea Party point. I think there are two Tea Parties, and you mentioned that Tim Scott's the chief of staff, which I didn't know about, but Alan West, the woman he tried to hire to be his chief of staff, she said, she's a radio personality, and said that she thinks that
I'm sorry, that's who I was.
Okay. She said if an immigrant is caught committing a crime here, I believe they should be strung up from the telephone poles or something like that, and the body should be sent back to wherever they came from. Was removed. Right. That no. That's what the defense is coming.
But Danny, before the defense, just for the record, that does sound anti-immigrant.
That sounds racist.
Yeah,
I think you could put any label you want on that, and it wouldn't be a bad enough label for that. Fortunately, she's not coming here to Washington, although he's unapologetic about it. He wishes he could have had her. So there is that element. But what I was saying is there's two Tea Parties going on here. There's one that's 20-25% of the population, and there's the very small minority who come to the rallies, and I believe they're entirely separate groups. The ones who come to the rallies are themselves a tiny minority of this a significant part of the population, and there is some minority of those who are overtly racist, and I've seen them. You may not have, but I've seen them there on the Capitol grounds with the the Joker
I thought
face.
you were defending David.
I am.
It's coming.
It's a partial. So
I'm waiting.
There is that element, and that is what we in the media are seizing on. I go to a rally, I look around, and if I see a photograph of Dachau with trying to use that to make a comparison to the healthcare. Well, you know what? I'm actually going to focus on that and not on the 99% of people who were perfectly calm and reasonable. So that's what I would do in the media. So I would say the absolute vast majority of people in the Tea Party movement are just unhappy about the economy, angry that the government's not doing anything, and are good and decent people. There's no way around it. They're going to be tarred with what people
all of this
say.
conversation, Ariana, leads me to this for you specifically. I'm sure others will want to chime in on this. The Tea Party, the impact they've had. We've just now been talking about not one but two African-American congressmen who happen to both be Republicans, Mr. West out of Florida, Mr. Scott out of South Carolina. However you want to slice and dice this, Republicans now control the House, as we all know. Tell me why I should not believe that the strategy that President Obama is going to employ over the next 2 years is going to be Clintonian to the core, which means more triangulation, more pages stolen out of their playbook, which means more compromise and more capitulation. Disabuse me, please, please, of that notion.